So now that we have the basics of designing an outdoor environment inside Unity, let's take a look at Playmaker and see what we can do to enhance the user experience. So at this point, I'll assume that you've purchased Playmaker, and there are two ways to purchase that. That was through the Unity Asset Store or from the developer website. Now, I have mine purchased through the Unity Asset Store, and the way that I'll access this and activate Playmaker in this project is from Unity. I'll go to Window, Asset Store, and from the Asset Store, I gotta make sure that I'm logged in, and once the Unity Asset Store comes up, there's a little button over here of previously downloaded content, our download manager, and I'm gonna hit the download manager, and I'm looking for Playmaker. So it shows up in alphabetical order. I have my import button here because I've already downloaded it. But if you do not have the import button available, that means you need to hit the download button. Once you download it, it's available for import, and I'll hit the import button, and it'll take a minute to decompress the package, and it'll load Playmaker directly into the project that we're working on. Now it'll take a moment, and there'll be another window that pops up that asks me if I want to import all the assets, and I'm going to let things default and just say import. Now, once that's done importing, I can close the window that I'm working on. I can close the asset store and begin to set up Playmaker inside my Unity project. Now, if you've purchased this asset from the developer website, you should have downloaded a Unity package file, a playmaker.unity package, and you can import Playmaker as a package directly into your project simply by going to the Assets menu. So I'm going to close my Unity Asset Store. And at this point, I'm ready to use Playmaker. But if you've purchased your Playmaker through the developer website, you're going to need to go to Assets, Import Package, and choose a custom package. Once you choose custom package, you can navigate for the Playmaker package and choose to open, and you'll follow the same process that I just went through. So once we activate Playmaker, we can tell that it's active. If we look at the system menu up here, we see that there's a Playmaker drop-down menu. Now, if yours doesn't become available, just click on the system menu inside Unity, and it'll update with the Playmaker menu. And we want to focus on two windows. The first thing that we'll do is I'm going to click on the Playmaker drop-down window. I'm going to choose the Playmaker editor. This is where most of the magic's going to happen inside Playmaker. I am going to close up this pop-up screen that comes up, and I do want to point out there is some really valuable information and tutorials and support through this little pop-up that shows up. But I'm gonna turn this off at startup, and I'm just going to close that window. We can always reopen that later if we need to. Now this is the Playmaker editor window, and we're going to spend a lot of time looking at this. But when I lose focus of this window, so if I go back to my scene file and I try to work on it, you can see that I lose focus of my Playmaker editor. So what I want to do is I want to reopen my Playmaker editor, and Unity is highly customizable in terms of the interface, and I want to take advantage of that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the Playmaker tab, I'm going to grab it by the tab, and I'm going to start to drag it around, and I could nest that into different areas on the screen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to nest mine next to my project assets, and I'm just going to wait until that snaps over to the right side of the project. And so this is going to be my preferred setup, where I can see my assets inside Unity. I can still look at my project assets, and I can look to the right and find my Playmaker editor window. Now, if you're working on a laptop or have a small screen, low resolution screen to look at, you could potentially nest Playmaker behind the project, but there's going to be some times where we want to select content inside the assets or the project tab and then move over to Playmaker. And it's easy enough to do with this tab navigation, but for the sake of the demo, so that you can see what I'm doing, I'm going to split my viewport here so that I see my project and my Playmaker editor. In addition to that, I also want the Playmaker editor windows, and I want to look for the action browser. When I open up the action browser, this is a menu that we're going to choose a lot of functionality based on whatever kinds of interactivity or mechanics that we want to create. So this is something I'm going to spend a lot of time looking at. And we could open this window and close it as needed, but it's going to be much easier if we just leave it open to explore it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to nest this to the right of my inspector window so that I can still select content in my project window, and I can still look at the inspector window over here. So As I click around on my hierarchy, I still have my inspector, and over on the right side I have my action browser. Now this is the way that I'll set things up, and I took a minute to make sure that I got things just the way that I wanted to. And Unity gives us the ability, if we look in the top right hand corner, there's a layout drop down menu. If I click on the layout, I can save my current layout. Now I've already done this, so I'm just going to close it. I have a Playmaker set up for my Unity application that if the panels get turned around or I open up a few other things, I can always just snap back down to the Playmaker panel. So again, if I'm looking at a 4-split window or a wide or tall or whatever the case, and I lose Playmaker, I can always go back and just choose that Playmaker window. So there we go. Now I'm going to jump back over to where my first-person controller was inside the scene. And just a quick reminder, you know, we spent a little bit of time getting our environment up and running. I went into my standard assets and I pulled out the first-person controller. So I went into character controllers, I grabbed my first-person controller and I threw that inside the scene. At this point, when I hit the play button, I can run around inside my scene and I see that my textures are looking okay. I have a skybox in the scene, and now I'm ready to add a layer of interactivity to my island project. We're going to take another pass and continue to explore the aesthetics of this project, but for now I want to start to work in some basic usability or some basic interaction for the player. And the way that I'm going to do this is I'll start to rely heavily on Playmaker to build scripts and mechanics. Now Playmaker is a visual scripting tool, and it's known as a state machine. And we'll talk about the details of the state machine once we get a handle on how Playmaker works. But for now, I just want to share with you a couple of basic concepts. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a cube that I can experiment with. So I'm going to go to the Game Object menu, I'm going to choose Create Other, and I'm going to create a cube inside this environment. Now the way that Playmaker works is that whatever object we have selected, we can start to add a finite state machine, or an FSM, or simply a state machine, to this object to control some of its behaviors. And as an example, what I'll do is I have the cube selected. I can tell because it's highlighted in the hierarchy. I can also tell because I have the axes showing up here. I'm going to go into the Playmaker editor window, and in this big gray field here, I'm going to right click and choose to add an FSM. I'll refer to these as we keep adding these simply as state machines or machines, but this is how you initialize a finite state machine on an object using Unity. Now what we have here is we have a start condition, and a state machine always starts from the start and flows into our current state. Now we have the ability to build multiple states, and we'll start to build, you know, pretty complex interactions. And the key concept is that we can add some functionality to the state, we can make some decisions, and based on some logic or certain conditions, we can pass this over to another state where some other conditions are true. So just to kind of experiment with some of the basic concepts of Playmaker, what I'm going to do is just make a note that I've added a state machine to this object, and if I look in the hierarchy here, I can see that there's a little icon, a developer icon that's showing up inside my hierarchy that tells me that I have an active state machine on it. Now what I'm going to do is I have state 1 selected, and if I look over here in the actions browser, what I'm going to do is look for the transform menu. And inside the transform menu there's a lot of different options, and it just so happens that within the transform options we're affecting the transform component of whatever we have selected. So we can adjust things like position, rotation, scale, and there's a number of other things that we can do. What I want to do, just to experiment, is to select rotate and add this action to this state. Now the Playmaker editor window is split into two different sort of compartments. On the left side, this is where our states exist. And on the right side, these tabs allow us to investigate the FSM, or the machine that we have selected. We can look at the individual states, we can create events, and we can establish variables for the state machine. Now I'm going to go back to the state tab because that's going to show me the content of whatever is active on state 1. I'm going to take this rotate action, and I'm either going to drag and drop the rotate action into the state window, or I'll Command Z to undo that, or I'll simply double click to add the rotate. And what this is saying is that when this cube becomes active, when it spawns inside the scene, it's going to run whatever condition is on state 1. If I look at this, it says rotate. The game object that we're looking to rotate is the owner of this state machine, which in this case will work just fine because we're talking about the cube. And the cube owns the state machine that we just created. And we can rotate this along an X, Y, or Z. Now I want to rotate this, just for the demonstration, I want to rotate it around the Y, or the up axis, which will cause it to kind of spin this way. Okay, or it'll cause it, if I just kind of jog the Y rotation in the transform field, I can get a sense of what the Y rotation is doing. So if I, wanted to rotate it around Z, I could get a sense of what that's going to look like just by kind of playing with those values. So I'm going to go back down to the state, the rotate action, and I'm going to adjust the Y angle. Now, I want to point out a couple of things. Whenever you come across a drop-down menu inside Playmaker, that usually means that it's looking for a value that's based on a variable. We'll talk about variables a little bit later, but I want to hard code a Y angle into this field, and when I click on it, it just says none. If I look over to the right, there's this little gray button over here, and if I click on that, that switches between using a hard value or using a variable. So I'll uncheck that, or I'll turn that toggle button off, and now you can see that I have a Y angle of 0, and I'm going to change that value to, let's say, 90. And what that's going to do is that's going to rotate this cube 90 degrees, and I'll select this per second option down here every time the frame refreshes. So the basic logic here is that when this cube is spawned, or when it exists inside the Unity environment, when this simulation is running, we're going to start and pass it to the state 1. State 1's job is simply has an action that says rotate. And we can control the speed of the rotation based on what the angle is that we're rotating. So let's test this. I'm going to hit the play button, and I'll take a look back down onto my beach here. Let's see, I can't see my cube. Where did my cube go? I see it inside the scene. Oh, there it is. It's up over my head. Okay, so there's my cube. It's rotating. It's doing its thing. And if you look down in the Playmaker editor window, you can see that I'm actually getting a preview of what the current state is. I can see that my state is highlighted with a little green outline, and that means that I'm stuck in state 1. I'm going to toggle the play button, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about what some of the options are within this state machine. Now, you'll notice that I can focus on my Playmaker editor window, and I can see what the states are here. If I inadvertently deselect, or if I'm making some design decisions around my map, and I lose the ability to adjust this state machine, just remember that it's based on the object that you had selected. So if I go back to the cube, mine happens to have a little developer icon. It's just a little heads up display to let me know that that does in fact have a state machine on it. And if I select that cube and I draw my focus back down to the Playmaker editor window, I can see the active states. Okay. There's a couple of other ways that I can select active state machines, and we'll take a look at that once we start to familiarize ourselves with the basic functionality of Playmaker. Now, Playmaker, as I mentioned, is set up in this notion of state machines, which means that we can have one thing happen on one state, and then we can pass it to another state and have something else happen. And we can start to kind of link a bunch of actions together and have a number of actions happen on a given state, and then pass it to another state to have different conditions true. So right now we have this simple rotation going on, but let me add a translate function. Now what translate does, and I'll just double click to add translate, you'll notice that I now have two actions on this state. And I'll just scroll up. And the hierarchy starts to become important here, because the way that Playmaker works is that it'll conduct whatever action comes first, and even if they're simultaneously happening, it's going to activate the first action and then pass it down to conduct the second action. The first action is rotate, and that's starting to rotate 90 degrees along the line. I'm going to translate this object, And I'll translate this object, which simply means just move it over the course of time. And I want to move it according to the z-axis. So I'll toggle this button like I did in rotate, and I'll just key in a hard value, and I'll just choose 10. Now, you'll notice that when we rotate or translate things, if we look at all the options that are available, in both cases we see that the space that we're rotating within, or the space that we're translating in, it refers to self. And there's two different options here. We can translate or rotate or move an object based on its self position or its self axis, or we can change this to its world axis. Now I'm going to leave this set to self for now, just so we can see what happens. And I want to cause this to translate along its own z-axis on itself, so on its own z-axis, per second every frame. So now when I hit the play button, my cube should start to move through space while it rotates. And if I look up, it looks like it's just kind of, looks like it's rotating with its axis somewhere over here. But what's happening is this cube is rotating, and we're telling it to move according to its z-axis. Now watch what happens. Remember, its z-axis is this blue axis here. If I take this cube and I rotate it along the y-axis, you can see that its blue z-axis changes direction. So what's happening is that as this cube starts to rotate, it starts to move in its forward direction. And we're telling it to rotate, and so basically it's driving around in a circle. I can change that, and I can correct for this. Instead of moving it along its own z-axis relative to the direction that it's pointing to, I can say, well, don't move along your self-coordinate system, move along the world coordinate system. And so now we're telling it to move according to z, which is an absolute direction. It's the world direction that we can see up here in this widget. It's always going to move off in the z direction. I'll hit the play button, and I'll look up at the sky at my cube, and it's just kind of taking off into space while it rotates. And it'll just keep going until we tell it otherwise. And at this point, that cube is doing exactly what this state machine is telling it to do. It's moving off in a direction. Now, we can start to layer different actions along with different states, and we'll just look at building a really simple machine that causes this cube to kind of move back and forth. And this could be handy for something like if you're creating kind of a platformer, which we'll take advantage of some of that functionality here in just a bit. But I'm going to create a simple state machine that causes this cube to kind of move forward and backwards in space. So we already have the forward motion set up, and that was by creating a simple state that in this case rotates and translates. But I'm going to rebuild this from the ground up and pay special attention to the kind of machine that I'm going to build. And I'm actually going to exclude this rotate. So we'll do that in the next presentation. For now, experiment with getting Playmaker up and running. Throw a cube into the equation and play with the transform rotate and the transform translate. And we'll take a look at an immediate application for this kind of state machine in the next presentation.